The silence was the first violation. It was a manufactured thing, a pressure against the eardrum that was heavier than any sound. In the penthouse suite of the Citadel's spire, the air did not move. It was scrubbed, filtered, and chilled to a precise 17 degrees Celsius, a temperature designed for preservation, not life. Kale moved through it like a swimmer in deep water, his every motion a disturbance in the perfect, sterile equilibrium. His breath, held tight in his chest, was a contraband warmth. His synth leather boots made no sound on the polished obsidian floor, a surface so black it seemed to drink the light from the floor-to-ceiling windows. Outside, the city sprawled, a neural network of light and shadow, but in here there was only the cold, steady glow of recessed lumen strips and the silent hum of the atmospheric regulator. He was a ghost in the machine, a glitch in the code of this perfect, ordered world. He was here to steal a memory. His target was not currency, nor jewels, nor even sensitive corporate data. It was a thing of impossible value because it had none at all, save to the man who owned this place. A C7 data locket, antiquated technology, a small silver filigree orb no larger than his thumb, obsolete yet encrypted with a biometric lock that had taken Kale 3 weeks of sleepless, caffeine-fueled nights to ghost. The intel said the Alpha who lived here, Director Reese Valka, kept it in a static field display case in his private study, a trophy, a reminder. Kale didn't care what it was for. He only cared about the price it would fetch from a collector who specialized in the sentimental artifacts of the powerful. The price was enough. Enough for off-grid passage, enough for unregistered medical supplies, enough for a chance at a life that wasn't lived in the damp, crowded warrens of the Undercroft, breathing recycled air thick with the scent of mildew and desperation. He found the study. The door slid open with a whisper of displaced air, revealing a room that was a monument to control. Books, real paper books with stiff spines, were arranged not by author or subject, but by color, a perfect gradient of cream to black. A single chair, a marvel of ergonomic cruelty, faced a desk that was a seamless slab of white polymer. And on the desk, suspended in a shimmering cube of blue light, was the locket. Kyle's pulse, a frantic, frightened bird in his throat, beat a rhythm against the oppressive quiet. He slipped a dampener field over the case, the blue light flickering and dying without a sound. The static shield collapsed. His fingers, thin and trembling slightly, closed around the cool metal of the orb. It was lighter than he expected, delicate as a dead bird. He slipped it into a shielded pouch at his hip, the weight of his future settling against him. It was then that he smelled it. Beneath the chemical sterility, the ozone scent of high-altitude air, and the faint metallic tang of the filtration system, there was something else, a scent that did not belong here. It was faint, almost undetectable, a ghost of a fragrance that spoke of cold stone after a rainstorm, of ozone from a lightning strike, and something deeper, something impossibly ancient and predatory, petrichor and power. It was an alpha's scent, but not the brutish, aggressive musk of the enforcers in the Undercroft. This was a scent of absolute, calculated stillness. It was the scent of the man who owned this silence. Kyle froze, every nerve ending screaming. The scent wasn't in the air. It was embedded in the room itself, in the very fabric of the place, a territorial marker so subtle it was almost subliminal. He had been so focused on the technology, on the silence, that he had failed to notice the one thing his suppressed Omega biology should have screamed at him about. He was in a predator's den. He had to leave. Now. He turned, his movements suddenly clumsy, loud in his own ears. A drop of sweat traced a path down his temple, a slow, cold violation of his composure. As he reached the door, his boot caught on the edge of the desk. A misstep, a fractional error. He stumbled, his hand flying out to brace himself against the white polymer surface. A sharp, stinging pain flared in his palm as a sliver of synth steel, an almost invisible decorative edge, sliced through his glove and into his skin. He hissed, pulling his hand back. A single drop of blood, dark and shockingly vibrant against the sterile white, welled from the cut. One drop, a universe of incriminating data. His DNA, his designation, his entire pathetic, unregistered history, all contained in that tiny sphere of crimson. Panic, cold and sharp, pierced the adrenaline. He swiped at it with his gloved hand, smearing the blood in a desperate, foolish attempt to erase his presence. But it was too late. The smear was a signature, a confession. He fled, out of the study, through the cavernous living space, and towards the ventilation shaft he'd used for entry. The silence chased him, the cold air pushing at his back. He did not look back at the city lights, at the world he was trying to buy his way out of. He only felt the phantom weight of the locket at his hip and the throb of the cut on his hand. He had the prize. He had what he needed. But as he slid back into the guts of the building, into the dusty, rumbling darkness of the service shafts, he could not shake the feeling that he had not stolen something from the silent penthouse. He had left something behind, a part of himself, smeared in blood on a white desk, an offering left on an altar he hadn't known he was trespassing upon. And the scent of cold rain and lightning clung to him, a promise of a storm to come. He was not just a thief, he was marked. The undercroft smelled of life, which was to say, it smelled of decay. The air was a thick soup of damp concrete, unrecycled protein broth, and the cloying sweetness of the hydroponic fungus farms, all underpinned by the metallic tang of desperation. Here silence was a myth. There was always a drip of water, the hum of an overloaded power conduit, the distant shriek of the maglevs overhead, and the constant, murmuring wash of too many bodies crammed into too little space. Kyle navigated the narrow, pipelined corridors by memory, his small frame slipping through gaps in the slow-moving river of people. He kept his head down, his scent blocker patch turned to maximum, a small, cold circle on his neck that deadened his biology, rendering him a neutral, unnoticeable ghost. He was nobody, just another shadow in a city of shadows. The locket in his pouch felt like a burning coal against his skin, a secret that made him a target. His destination was a stall in the makeshift bazaar known as the Sump, a chaotic network of stalls lit by salvaged lumen strips and flickering hole ads. The proprietor was a man named Jax, a data broker with cybernetically augmented eyes and a reputation for discretion that was only slightly better than his reputation for greed. Kale found him behind a curtain of sparking wires, hunched over a disassembled terminal. "I have it," Kale whispered, his voice hoarse. He didn't need to say what it was. Jax's multifaceted lenses whirred, focusing on Kale's face with unnerving precision. "The price has changed," Jax grunted, not looking up from his work. "The risk profile has been elevated." Kale's stomach tightened. "We had a deal, Jax. 20,000 credits, no less." "The client is particular," Jax said, a thin, cruel smile playing on his lips. He has increased his offer significantly, but he requires a direct exchange. He wants to verify the acquisition himself. A cold dread, colder than the air in the penthouse, washed over Kyle. This was wrong. This was a break in protocol. Brokers existed to be the buffer, the anonymous firewall between client and asset. A direct meeting was a trap. No, Kyle said, his voice firm. The original terms. You verify it, you transfer the credits. That's how this works. Jax finally looked up, his augmented eyes glowing a soft, predatory red in the gloom. The terms are no longer your concern. Asset 734. The designation, his old creche number, hit Kyle like a physical blow. No one knew that number. It was buried, erased, a ghost from a life he had clawed his way out of. Before he could react, two figures materialized from the shadows behind him. Large, silent, their grey uniforms the unmistakable mark of Directorate enforcers. Their scent was a blunt instrument, acrid, sterile aggression. They grabbed his arms, their grip like iron vices. Panic flared, hot and useless. He didn't struggle. In the Undercroft, struggling only got you killed faster. They dragged him through the back of the stall into a service corridor he'd never seen before. It was clean. The walls were smooth. The air was filtered. They were leaving the chaos of the sump and entering the ordered, controlled world of the topside. They were taking him up. A private elevator, sleek and silent, ascended with sickening speed. Kyle's ears popped. The pressure mounted. When the doors opened, he was standing in a place he recognized with a jolt of pure terror. The polished obsidian floor. The view of the city as a god might see it. He was back in the penthouse. A figure stood by the window, his back to them. A tall, severe silhouette against the glittering cityscape. He was perfectly still, a statue carved from shadow and authority. "Leave us," the figure said. His voice was calm, measured, a low baritone that vibrated in the unnatural silence. It was the voice of command, the voice of a man who had never been disobeyed. The enforcers released Kale, shoving him forward onto the cold floor. They retreated, and the elevator doors closed with a soft, final hiss. He was alone with the man. The man turned slowly. Kale had expected someone imposing, a physical brute. But Director Reese Valka was built of clean lines and quiet intensity. His face was sharp, ascetic, his eyes a pale, piercing grey that seemed to see not just Kale, but the frantic, messy code of his thoughts. He wore a simple, dark tunic that bespoke immense wealth through its perfect tailoring rather than any overt decoration. And his scent. It was the scent from the study, but stronger now, undiluted. Cold stone, ozone, and something like the deep, dark earth after a winter freeze. It was a scent of immense, restrained power. It didn't scream dominance. It stated it as an incontrovertible fact. Reese's gaze fell to Kale's hand. He saw the crude bandage Kale had wrapped around the cut. "You left something behind," Reese said, his voice devoid of anger. It was worse than anger. It was a voice of pure, clinical observation. He gestured to the white desk, which was now pristine. A biological signature. Omega designation. Unregistered, with markers indicating prolonged use of illegal grade suppressants. Kale's blood ran cold. He was exposed. Every secret he had was laid bare. Reese took a step closer. Kale flinched, pressing himself back against the floor, a primal instinct to make himself smaller. Reese stopped, his expression unreadable. "The locket you stole," he continued, his tone conversational, "is worthless. The encryption is tied to my biometric signature. To anyone else, it is a dead piece of metal. Then why? Kyle croaked, the word scraping his dry throat. Why bring me here? Reese's pale eyes held his. For the first time, Kyle saw a flicker of something beneath the calm, controlled surface, something that wasn't calculation. It looked like hunger, but not for flesh. It was a different kind of starvation. Because you trespassed, Reese said softly, the words landing like stones in the silence. You left a mark on my property, and in doing so, you have incurred a debt. The locket is irrelevant. The blood you spilled, however, that has a price, and it is something money cannot buy. The gilded cage was a masterpiece of sensory deprivation. After the chaotic, scent-saturated world of the Undercroft, Reese Valka's penthouse was a vacuum. Kyle was given a room, a space larger than any 3 Undercroft HAB units combined, with one wall made entirely of smart glass that could be programmed to show any view in the city or be made opaque. The bed was a self-leveling pressure mattress. The clothes in the closet were simple tunics of a grey, textureless synth silk, and the food arrived via a silent panel in the wall, perfectly balanced, tasteless, nutrient paste. There were no locks on his door, yet he was more imprisoned than he had ever been in his life. The prison was the silence, the sterility, the utter lack of stimulation. It was a space designed to unmake a person, to strip them down to their basic components. Reese was a phantom presence. He was rarely seen, but Kyle felt his observation constantly. A flicker of a shadow in a reflective surface, the faint, lingering scent of petrichor in a room he had just vacated. He had taken Kale's scent blocker patch. The terms of your repayment require a baseline reading, he had explained, his voice as clinical as the med scanner he'd used to catalogue Kyle's vitals. The suppressants have damaged your system. We need to observe the reversion process. Kyle had said nothing. Arguing was pointless. He was no longer a person. He was an experiment. He was not a thief. He was not an Omega. He was an asset in arrears. The first few days were a blur of disorientation. Without the suppressants dulling his senses, the world began to bleed back in, sharp and painful. The hum of the atmospheric regulator, once subliminal, became a grating drone. The lumen strips seemed to sear his retinas. The faint, clean scent of the air scrubbers was an abrasive chemical burn in his nostrils. And then, there were the memories. With a chemical fog lifting from his mind, his past began to surface in fractured, unwelcome shards. He remembered the creche, a place that called itself a home but was a factory for producing compliant citizens. Rows of identical cots, the smell of antiseptic and recycled linen, the daily injections of hormonal regulators and scent suppressants, administered by impassive medtechs who never met their eyes. They were taught that their biology was a flaw, a chaotic variable that had to be controlled for the good of the directorate. Alphas were conditioned to lead, their aggression channeled into ambition. Betas were the functional backbone, their neutrality a virtue. And Omegas. Omegas were a vulnerability, their heats a biological crisis, their scents a social contaminant. They were liabilities to be managed. Kyle remembered the first time he had felt the faint, sweet stirrings of his own scent, a scent of wild thyme and damp earth, and the panic that had followed. He had been punished for it. His dosage of suppressants doubled until the scent was gone, until he felt nothing but a hollowed-out neutrality. He learned to be a ghost long before he ever set foot in the Undercroft. His escape from the crèche at 16 was less a heroic flight to freedom and more a desperate scramble for survival. He had been scheduled for assignment, a pairing with a state-sanctioned alpha to produce a desirable heir. The thought of it, of being a vessel, a biological function, had been more terrifying than starvation. So he had run. He had plunged into the anonymity of the undercroft, where he learned to steal, to lie, to erase himself so thoroughly that even the directorate's census sweeps couldn't find him. He had been running ever since. The money from the locket was meant for Misha, the old, half-senile beta who had taken him in when he first arrived in the sump. Misha was sick, a lung rot from the poor air quality, and the unregistered medicine was expensive. The thought of him, wheezing in his damp little room, sent a fresh wave of despair through Kale. His failure was not just his own. One evening, Rhys entered his room without a sound. Kale was sitting on the floor, staring at the opaque glass wall, lost in the grey landscape of his own thoughts. "Your endocrine levels are fluctuating," Rhys stated, not as a question, but as a fact. He held a data slate, its light casting his severe features in a pale blue glow. "The reversion is accelerating." Kyle didn't answer. He hugged his knees to his chest, a defensive posture he hadn't realized he'd taken. "I require your presence in the main living area," Rhys continued, "as part of the observation." It was not a request. Kyle followed him, his bare feet silent on the cold floor. Rhys gestured to a low-slung sofa. Kyle sat on the very edge, perched and ready to flee. Rhys took the chair opposite him, the one from the study, the cruel, ergonomic throne. Or he simply watched. The silence stretched, thick and suffocating. Kyle could feel his skin prickling, a strange heat building deep in his belly. It was an unfamiliar sensation, a ghost of a biological imperative he had suppressed for a decade. His own scent, faint and strange to his own nose, began to rise from his skin. Thyme and damp soil, hesitant and weak. But there, it felt like a shameful nakedness. Rhys's eyes narrowed slightly, a minute shift in his controlled expression. He inhaled, a slow, deliberate breath. "Interesting," he murmured, more to himself than to Kale. "The profile is atypical." Kale felt a surge of defiant anger. "Am I an interesting specimen, Director?" The words were sharper than he intended. Rhys's gaze met his. The pale grey eyes were like a winter sky. "You are a deviation from the expected," he replied, his voice even. "Everything about you is a deviation. That is why you are here. That is the first part of your debt. You will simply exist, and I will watch." The unraveling was not a gentle process. It was a violent tearing away of a decade's worth of chemical lies. Kyle's body, so long held in a state of artificial stasis, began to scream its way back to life. The world became a cacophony of sensation. The texture of the synth silk tunics felt like sandpaper against his newly sensitive skin. The nutrient paste, once merely bland, now tasted of its chemical components, a bitter metallic slurry that he could barely force down. Sleep offered no escape. His dreams were vivid, chaotic things, filled with the ghosts of scents and emotions he had never been allowed to feel. He would wake up shivering, his heart pounding, the sheets damp with a cold sweat. He was a stranger in his own body, a passenger in a vessel that was charting a course back to its factory settings, and the journey was agonizing. His own scent was the most disorienting part of the transformation. It grew stronger each day, a strange, wild perfume that clung to his skin and clothes. It smelled of things that did not exist in this sterile city: crushed wild herbs, damp forest floor, a hint of something resinous and green, like pine needles. It was the scent of a life he had never lived, a genetic memory of a world before the citadel scraped the sky. It felt profoundly intimate, and to have it blooming in this cold, sterile cage felt like a violation. He would wrap his arms around himself, trying to contain it, to hide it, but it was as unstoppable as a tide. He was becoming himself, and he had never felt more exposed. Reese's presence was a constant, unnerving pressure. He maintained his clinical distance, observing Kale with the detached curiosity of a researcher studying a rare, unpredictable organism. He would sit in his chair for hours, perfectly still, his pale eyes tracking Kale's every movement. Sometimes he would make notes on his data slate. Other times he would simply watch, his breathing the only sound in the room. Kale found himself becoming acutely aware of the alpha's scent. It was the anchor in his sensory storm, the one constant in his chaotic new reality. The cold, clean smell of ozone and petrichor was a paradox. It was the scent of his captor, the scent of the system that had broken him, yet it was also a scent of immense control, of stillness. In a world that was suddenly too loud, too bright, too much, the sheer, unwavering discipline of Reese's scent was a strange sort of comfort. It was the eye of the hurricane that was raging inside Kale. One afternoon, a wave of heat so intense it made him gasp washed through him. It started deep in his belly, a molten core that spread through his limbs, making his muscles tremble and his skin flush. He stumbled, catching himself on the wall, his breath coming in short, sharp pants. His scent flooded the room, thick and sweet, the herbal notes deepening into something richer, muskier. It was the scent of offering, the scent of need. It was the first tremor of a preheat, a biological event he had only ever read about in dry clinical textbooks at the creche. He had never imagined the reality of it, the raw physical power of it, the complete surrender of conscious thought to primal instinct. He slid down the wall, curling into a ball on the floor, his body shaking with a mixture of fear and a bewildering, unfamiliar ache. From across the room, Reese went utterly still. The data slate in his hand slipped from his fingers, clattering onto the obsidian floor with a sound that was shockingly loud in the silent apartment. Kyle looked up through a haze of confusion and saw him. The mask was gone. For a single, unguarded moment, the director was gone, and in his place was just an alpha. His pupils were dilated, his posture rigid, every line of his body screaming attention that mirrored the storm in Kyle's. His scent, usually so controlled, thickened in the air, the ozone note sharpening, the scent of rain on stone becoming a deluge. It was a scent of pure, undiluted instinct, a response to the clarion call of Kale's own biology. He took a half-step forward, a predatory, unconscious movement before he caught himself. The mask slammed back into place. He bent down, retrieving the data slate with a hand that was not quite steady. "The hormonal surge is more significant than projected," he said, his voice strained, tight. He did not look at Kale. He looked at a point on the wall just above Kale's head. "The observation protocols will need to be adjusted." He turned and left the room, his movements stiff, precise, and far too quick. The door slid shut behind him, leaving Kale alone on the floor, trembling in the sudden, echoing silence. He was left with the lingering, supercharged scent of a predator fighting its own nature, and the terrifying realization that his unraveling was inextricably tied to the unraveling of the man who held him captive. The experiment was no longer unilateral. The observer was being affected by the observed. The air in the penthouse grew thick with unspoken things. After the incident, a new, fragile tension settled between them. Reese no longer conducted his observations in the same room. He watched Cale through the apartment's integrated surveillance system, a network of sensors and lenses so subtle they were almost invisible. Cale knew he was being watched, but the physical absence of the alpha was a small mercy. It allowed him to navigate the rising tide of his own biology without the suffocating pressure of Reese's immediate presence. The pre-heat symptoms ebbed and flowed, waves of feverish warmth and a deep, persistent ache that settled in his bones. His scent was a living thing now, changing with his moods, sharp and green with anxiety, soft and sweet in moments of quiet despair. He felt like a garden breaking through concrete, a messy, organic process that had no place in this world of sterile precision. One night, unable to sleep, Kyle found himself drawn to the study. The door was unlocked. It was always unlocked. The room was dark, save for the cool blue glow of the empty static field display case on the desk. He ran his fingers over the smooth, white polymer, his eyes tracing the spot where his blood had been. A ghost of a stain. He felt a sudden, inexplicable urge to understand, not just his own situation, but the man who had orchestrated it. Why this room? Why that locket? What memory was so precious that its theft warranted this elaborate psychological punishment? His gaze fell upon the bookshelf, the perfect, sterile gradient of color. On impulse, he reached out and pulled one of the books from the middle of the shelf. It was bound in dark grey leather, its title stamped in simple silver foil, On the Phenomenology of Scent. He opened it. It wasn't a book. The pages were hollowed out, and nestled inside was a hidden biometric scanner. Curiosity, sharp and reckless, overrode his fear. He pressed his thumb to the scanner. It glowed red. Access denied. Of course, it would be keyed to Reese. He was about to replace it when he remembered the smear of blood, the signature he had left behind. Reese had his biometric data. Perhaps he had been granted access for a reason. He thought about the way Reese had watched him, the clinical detachment warring with something else, something deeper. Was this another test, another part of the observation? He took a breath and placed his palm, the one with the still healing cut, flat against the book's cover. He wasn't sure what he was doing, only that it felt right. For a long moment, nothing happened. Then a soft click echoed in the silence. A hidden panel in the wall beside the bookshelf slid open, revealing a small, dark alcove. Inside, resting on a velvet pedestal, was the C7 data locket. He stared at it, his heart pounding. It hadn't been an empty threat. Reese truly had it. But why show him? Why give him access? He picked it up. The filigree orb was cool against his skin. As his fingers closed around it, the metal warmed and the locket activated. Not with a projection of light or sound, but with something far more intimate. A wave of sensory data washed over him, bypassing his eyes and ears and plugging directly into the most primitive part of his brain. He smelled it first, a scent that was not his own, not Reese's. It was the scent of sunlight on clean linen, of milk and honey, of blooming night jasmine. It was an Omega's scent, warm, gentle, and profoundly happy. Then came the feelings, a cascade of emotions that were not his, a deep, abiding love, a sense of safety, a quiet, joyful contentment. He saw flashes of imagery not as a video, but as memories, hands intertwined, one large and pale, the other smaller, warmer, a shared smile in the reflection of a window overlooking the city. A soft whisper, the name Elian, breathed like a prayer. He was experiencing the memories stored in the locket. He was feeling Reese's love for another. The sensory flood was overwhelming. He stumbled back, dropping the locket. It rolled across the floor, the projection ceasing instantly. He was left panting in the dark room, the ghost of jasmine and honey clinging to his senses, the phantom ache of another's love echoing in his chest. Elian. That was the name. That was the Omega Reese had lost. The truth of it settled on him, heavy and devastating. This wasn't about a crime. This wasn't about punishment. This was about grief. Reese wasn't a cold, calculating monster. He was a man drowning in a memory, a man who had built a sterile, silent mausoleum around a single, vibrant ghost. The locket wasn't a trophy. It was a lifeline. It was the only way he could remember the scent, the touch, the feeling of the person he had bonded with. Kyle hadn't just stolen an object. He had stolen the last remnant of a dead man's soul. A sound from the doorway made him freeze. Reese stood there, a dark shape against the light of the corridor. He wasn't looking at Kale. He was staring at the locket lying on the floor. His face, for the first time, was completely bare. All the control, all the authority, all the clinical detachment was gone, stripped away to reveal a raw, profound sorrow that was breathtaking in its intensity. "He was my bondmate," Reese said, his voice quiet, rough with an emotion Kale had never heard from him before. "He was everything the directorate says we should not be. Illogical, inefficient, a vulnerability." He finally raised his eyes to meet Kale's. The pale grey was dark with unshed tears. "The system I uphold, the system I was built to embody, is what killed him. A standard issue fever suppressant had an unforeseen interaction with his biology. A 1 in a billion anomaly, an acceptable loss according to the official report." He took a shaky breath. "He died in my arms, and the last thing to go was his scent." The confession hung in the air between them, a fragile, terrible thing. The room was no longer a study. It was a tomb. And Kyle finally understood. He finally understood everything. The revelation fractured the dynamic between them, shattering the roles of captor and captive. They were now just two broken people in a silent room, bound by a ghost. The silence that followed Reese's confession was different from the sterile, oppressive silence that had defined the penthouse. This was a heavy, grieving silence, filled with the weight of what had been said. Kale saw Reese not as a director, not as an alpha, but as a widower, a man so hollowed out by loss that he had encased himself in the very system that had destroyed his happiness, perhaps as a form of penance. Kale felt a surge of empathy, so strong it was dizzying. It was a dangerous emotion, an illogical and inefficient vulnerability, but it was there nonetheless. He bent down and picked up the locket, the cool metal, a stark contrast to the warmth of the memories it held. He held it out to Reese, an offering, a truce. Reese looked at the locket in Kale's hand, then at Kyle's face. He didn't take it. "When I found your blood sample," he said, his voice regaining a fraction of its former control, "the analysis showed more than just your designation. It showed a rare genetic marker. a sequence related to synaptic scent reception. It's an anomaly, almost identical to his. He gestured vaguely towards the empty space where Elian's memory had bloomed. I thought, if I could observe you, if I could study the reversion of your biology, I could understand the flaw in the system that failed him. I could prevent it from happening again. It was a logical, scientific pursuit. He paused, and the facade cracked again. That is what I told myself. He finally took the locket, his fingers brushing Kale's. The touch was brief, electric, a spark of warmth in the cold room. But it was a lie. The science is just an excuse, a justification for what I truly want. He looked at Kyle, and the hunger Kale had seen on that first day was back. But now he understood it. It was the desperate, soul-deep starvation of a man who had been sensorially and emotionally numb for years. I cannot feel him anymore, Reese whispered, the words raw, broken. The locket, it is a recording, a faint echo, but it is not real. With every passing day, the memory of his scent fades, the feeling of his presence. It's gone. I am surrounded by ghosts, and I can no longer remember what it felt like to be warm. He took a step closer, and his own scent, the cold petrichor and ozone, seemed to plead. The Directorate conditions alphas of my rank to suppress emotional responses, to sever the connection between instinct and action. It makes us effective leaders. It makes us empty. His gaze was intense, burning. But you are the opposite. You are reawakening. I see it. I can smell it. Your scent is real. Your fear is real. The heat building in your body is real. This was it, the true nature of the debt. It was more invasive, more terrifying than any physical punishment. What do you want from me? Kale asked, his voice barely a whisper. Reese's expression was one of profound, desperate longing. I want you to teach me how to feel again, he said, the words stark and terrible in their simplicity. I want you to let me observe. Not as a scientist, not as a director. I want to be in the presence of something true, something organic. I want to feel the heat from a living flame, not just remember the cold ashes. The request was a monstrous violation. He was asking to witness the most vulnerable, private moments of Kale's life, his impending heat. Not for pleasure, not for procreation, but as a cure for his own emotional death. It was the ultimate objectification. Kale should have been repulsed. He should have been terrified. And he was. But beneath the fear, that treacherous seed of empathy was sprouting. He looked at this powerful, broken man, a prisoner in a cage of his own making, and he saw a mirror of his own confinement. They were both trapped by the same system, just in different ways. He was trapped in a body he was forced to deny, and Reese was trapped in a mind he was forced to numb. This is the debt, Reese said softly, as if sensing his internal conflict. Not servitude, not punishment, a transaction, your freedom for my salvation. The choice was his. He could refuse, and perhaps Reese would let him go, a failed experiment. Or he could agree and step into a terrifying, unknown intimacy that might destroy them both. The heat did not arrive gently. It was a storm, a fever that broke through the last of Kyle's defenses and consumed him. The world dissolved into a blur of pure sensation. The cool floor against his overheated skin, the soft texture of the sheets he tangled himself in, the oppressive silence of the room that seemed to amplify the frantic pounding of his own heart. His body was no longer his own. It was an instrument of pure biological imperative, aching with a need so profound it erased thought. erased memory, erased everything but the raw, primal want. His scent poured from him, a thick, intoxicating wave of wild thyme and musk and something deeper, a sweet, earthy smell like rich soil warmed by the sun. It was a scent of utter surrender, a desperate broadcast into the sterile silence. He was lost. He had agreed. In a moment of what felt like madness, he had looked into Reese's desolate eyes and nodded. The terms were laid out with the cold precision of a contract. Reese would not touch him. He would not interfere. He would simply be present, a witness, an observer. Now, lost in the delirium of the heat, Cale wasn't sure if Reese was even there. The world had shrunk to the confines of his own skin, his own overwhelming need. He was vaguely aware of a glass of water appearing by the bed, of a cool cloth being laid on his forehead, but the actions were disconnected, dreamlike. The only anchor he had was a scent. Through the thick, sweet fog of his own aroma, another scent cut through, sharp and clean. Ozone and petrichor, the smell of an impending storm. It was a grounding presence in his chaotic world, a point of stillness in the raging tempest. It was Reese. Reese watched from the chair in the corner of the room, a sentinel in the shadows. He had thought he was prepared. He had thought he could maintain his clinical detachment. He had been a fool. To be in the presence of a true, unrestrained Omega heat after years of sensory deprivation was like a starving man being locked in a banquet hall. Cale's scent was not just a smell. It was a physical force, a pressure that pushed against his carefully constructed walls of control. It bypassed his logic, his training, his conditioning, and spoke directly to the ancient sleeping predator in his alpha DNA. His every instinct screamed at him to go to the Omega, to offer comfort, to offer release, to claim the source of that maddeningly beautiful scent. His hands clenched into fists on the arms of his chair, his knuckles white. The scent of rain on stone intensified around him, a reflection of the brutal storm of instinct he was barely containing. But it was more than just instinct. As he watched Cale twist in the throes of the fever, he felt something else, a painful, piercing empathy. He saw not just an Omega in heat, but a person in agony, a person so long denied their own nature that its re-emergence was a form of torment. Entangled within Cale's scent of need was a fragile, heartbreaking thread of fear. Fear of his own body, fear of his vulnerability, fear of the man watching him from the shadows. That fear was a blade in Reese's chest. He was causing this pain. This cure he was seeking was an act of profound cruelty. He had promised not to touch, and he was holding to that promise, but he realized with dawning horror that his very presence was a violation. He was feeding on Cale's pain, using his raw biological reality as a way to jumpstart his own deadened soul. Hours blurred into a single, extended moment of tension. The air in the room was electric, a supercharged atmosphere thick with the commingling scents of two opposing forces, Kyle's complete surrender and Reese's absolute restraint. It was a strange, painful symbiosis. Cale, lost in his fever, unconsciously gravitated toward the grounding scent of the alpha, turning his head on the pillow as if seeking the source of the coming rain. Reese, in turn, fed off the raw life force radiating from the Omega, the vibrant, chaotic energy, a stark contrast to his own empty stillness. The feelings were beginning to return to him, but they were not the gentle warmth he remembered from Elian. They were sharp, violent things, savage instinct, gut-wrenching guilt, a desperate, clawing loneliness. He was not being healed. He was being flayed alive. In the depths of the night, Kale cried out, a soft, broken sound of pure misery. It shattered Rhys's last defense. The contract, the rules, the clinical distance, it all dissolved in that one small sound. He rose from the chair, his movements stiff, and crossed the room. He knelt by the bed. Kyle's eyes, glazed with fever, fluttered open. He flinched, a raw instinct of fear. "It's all right," Rhys heard himself say, his voice rough, unfamiliar. "It's all right." He did not touch him. He simply knelt there, letting his scent, the calm, steady scent of cool stone and rain, wash over the Omega. He wasn't a scientist. He wasn't a predator. He was just a man, offering the only comfort he had left to give, his presence, not as a watcher, but as a witness. And in that moment of shared vulnerability, Kyle's scent softened, the edge of fear receding, leaving only the deep, aching musk of need. The storm had not passed, but for the first time they were weathering it together. The fever broke with the dawn. Light, pale and grey, filtered through the opaque glass, illuminating a scene of quiet devastation. The room was saturated with the aftermath of the storm, a lingering, complex scent of fulfilled ache, lingering heat, and the sharp, clean smell of ozone. Kale lay sleeping, a deep, exhausted slumber. His face, usually so tight with tension, was relaxed, vulnerable. Rhys had not left his side. He had remained kneeling by the bed all night, a silent vigil, his own body rigid with a control that had left him feeling hollowed and brittle. The experience had not been the cure he'd imagined. It had not filled the emptiness inside him. Instead, it had simply made him exquisitely aware of how vast that emptiness was. It had held up a mirror to his own brokenness. He had not touched Kale. He had kept his word. But the intimacy of the night had forged a different kind of bond between them, something more profound and more dangerous than a physical act. He had been a witness to the most vulnerable, elemental part of Kale's existence, and Kyle, in his delirium, had accepted his presence. They had shared a space of pure, unfiltered biology, a pocket of organic chaos in the heart of the sterile, controlled citadel. It felt like a transgression against everything the Directorate stood for. It felt like a prayer. He reached out, his hand hovering over Kyle's forehead, wanting to smooth back a damp strand of hair, to offer a simple, human touch. He stopped himself, his fingers curling into a fist. He had no right. The debt was not paid. If anything, it was now impossibly larger, and it was he who was the debtor. When Kyle awoke, the silence was the first thing he noticed. It was not the oppressive, manufactured silence of before. It was a soft, gentle quiet, like the stillness after a heavy snowfall. He felt weak, his limbs heavy, but the frantic, burning ache was gone, replaced by a deep, resonant calm. He turned his head and saw Rhys, still kneeling by the bed. His posture was one of exhaustion, the severe lines of his face softened by fatigue. He looked human. Kale remembered fractured moments from the heat delirium, a cool cloth, a quiet voice, the steady, grounding scent of rain. He hadn't been an observer. He had been a guardian, a strange, fragile trust, something he hadn't felt for anyone since Misha began to seed in the ravaged landscape of his heart. "Thank you," he whispered, his voice a dry rasp. Rhys looked up, his pale eyes meeting Kale's. There was no judgment in them, no clinical assessment, only a deep, shared weariness. "There is nothing to thank me for," Rhys said, his voice low. "I was selfish. This was for me, not for you." Before Kale could respond, A soft chime echoed through the penthouse. It was a sound Kale had never heard here before. Reese's expression tightened, the mask of the director snapping back into place. He rose to his feet, his movements once again precise and controlled. "That is the priority communication channel," he said, his tone flat, devoid of the emotion of moments before. From the Oversight Committee, he crossed to the main living area, activating the comms panel on the wall. A shimmering, life-sized hologram of a severe-faced woman in a high-collared directorate uniform materialized in the center of the room. Her eyes, cold and sharp, scanned the apartment before settling on Reese. "Director Valka," she said, her voice like chipping ice. "We have detected a significant, unscheduled biosignature event originating from your private residence, an omega-level hormonal surge, unregistered and unsuppressed. Explain." Reese stood perfectly still, his hands clasped behind his back. "It is a controlled experiment, Counselor," he replied, his voice calm, unwavering. "I am developing a more effective counter-agent for unscheduled heats in high-risk Omega assets. The subject is a stray from the Undercroft, acquired for this purpose." The lie was smooth, plausible, delivered with the absolute authority of his station. Kale, watching from the bedroom doorway, felt his blood run cold. He was being reduced back to a thing, a subject, an asset. The fragile connection of the night shattered. The counselor's eyes narrowed. "Your research was not sanctioned, Director, and harboring an unregistered Omega is a severe breach of protocol. The committee has voted. We are dispatching a sanitization team to secure the asset and escort you to a disciplinary review." The word sanitization was a sterile bureaucratic term for something brutal. It meant reprogramming, memory wipes, and biological neutralization. It meant they were coming to erase him. "The team will be there in 30 minutes, the counselor stated. "Do not interfere." The hologram dissolved, plunging the room back into silence. The system had noticed the glitch. The machine was moving to correct its error, and they were both trapped in its gears. Reese turned slowly, his face an unreadable mask of granite. The entire sterile world they had defied for one night was now closing in on them, ready to scrub them clean. 30 minutes. The words hung in the air like a death sentence. Kale's mind raced, a frantic search for an escape route, a ventilation shaft, a service hatch, the old familiar pathways of a rat in a maze. But this was not the Undercroft. This was the Citadel's spire. There were no hidden tunnels, no dark corners to disappear into. Every exit was a monitored choke point. They were trapped at the top of the world. "They will take you," Reese said, his voice a low, flat statement of fact. "They will wipe your memory, reset your endocrine system to a pre-pubescent state, and assign you to a menial labor post. You will cease to be you." The clinical description was more terrifying than any threat of violence. It was the complete annihilation of self. Kale looked at Reese, searching for any sign of the man who had knelt by his bed, the man who had spoken of grief and ghosts. He saw only the director, a cold, calculating embodiment of the system that was coming to destroy him. A surge of bitter betrayal rose in his throat. "And you?" Kyle spat, his voice trembling with a mixture of fear and rage. "What's your disciplinary review? A slap on the wrist? A temporary demotion?" Reese's gaze met his, and for a moment the director's mask slipped. Kale saw a flash of the same raw desolation from the study. "For me," Reese said, his voice quiet, It will be a full neurological recalibration. They will identify my attachment to Elian's memory as a systemic flaw, an inefficiency. They will remove it. They will erase him all over again, this time from my mind. I will be made more effective, more empty. The words struck Kyle with the force of a physical blow. They weren't just coming for him. They were coming for Reese's ghost, the one precious thing he had left. In that instant, Kale understood that Reese stood to lose more than he did. Kale would lose his future. Reese would lose his past, the very core of his grief, the pain that, however terrible, was the last proof he had ever loved at all. Their fates were intertwined. The system would not just punish them, it would correct them, stripping away the very human flaws that had drawn them together. "There is one way," Reese said, turning away from Kale and walking towards the large window overlooking the city. He placed his palm on the glass. "This spire is my design. I know its secrets, its weaknesses." A schematic of the building, a glowing blue web of conduits and structural supports bloomed on the glass before them. "The sanitization team will use the primary elevator. They will expect me to be compliant. They will not anticipate resistance." He pointed to a narrow channel running down the core of the building. "A maglev maintenance shaft. It runs from the roof to the sub-levels, bypassing all security checkpoints. It's a straight drop. The access panel is behind the west wall of this room." He turned back to Kale, his face grim, resolved. "I can get you to the Undercroft. From there, you will be on your own." Kyle stared at him. "You would do that? Help me escape. They'll kill you for it." "They will not kill me," Reese corrected, a flicker of dark, ironic humor in his tone. "That would be inefficient. They will simply fix me. What I'm doing now is illogical. It is an act of rebellion born from a flawed emotional response. It is the last decision I will ever make that is truly my own." This was the choice, the climax of his strange, terrible bargain. Reese was offering him his freedom, the very thing he had been trying to steal from the start. But the price was Reese's own self. He would be left behind to be hollowed out, to become the perfect, unfeeling machine the Directorate wanted him to be. And Kale would be free, but he would be haunted by the knowledge of that sacrifice. He looked from Reese's determined face to the glowing schematic on the window. He thought of the scent of rain and stone, a grounding force in the storm of his heat. He thought of the shared vulnerability in the dark, silent room. He thought of the name Elian, whispered like a prayer. He had come here to steal an object. He had stayed to repay a debt. But somewhere along the way, it had become something else entirely. "No," Kyle said, the word quiet but firm in the silent room. Reese turned, his expression of surprise the first genuine, unguarded reaction Kale had ever seen from him. "What?" "I'm not leaving you behind," Kale said, a strange, reckless courage solidifying in his chest. "You said it yourself. This is the last choice you'll make, so make it. Don't choose to save me. Choose to save yourself." He took a step closer into Reese's space, his own scent, now calm and settled, a quiet assertion of his presence. "You know the system's weaknesses. You know its secrets. Don't just use them to get me out. Use them to break us both out." The idea was insane. A fugitive director and an unregistered Omega against the entire monolithic power of the Directorate. It was suicide. But the alternative, Kyle's freedom at the cost of Reese's soul or their mutual sterile damnation, was unthinkable. For the first time, they were not captor and captive, not alpha and omega, not observer and subject. They were co-conspirators. A shared, defiant purpose flickered between them. Reese stared at him, his pale eyes searching Cale's face. The cool, calculating mind of the director was visibly at war with the grieving, desperate man underneath. The chime of the elevator, announcing its ascent from the ground floor, echoed through the apartment. The sanitization team was arriving. The choice had to be made. Now, the finality of the elevator's chime shattered the stillness. Reese's decision was not a spoken word, but an action. He crossed the room in 2 long strides, his hands slamming against a seamless section of the western wall. With a hiss of hydraulics, a panel slid away, revealing a dark, narrow opening and the low hum of an active magnetic field. The maintenance shaft. "They will breach the door in 90 seconds, Reese said, his voice stripped of all but urgent command. He grabbed a small, heavy bag from a hidden compartment. Emergency provisions, credit chips, a water purifier, medical supplies. He shoved it into Kyle's hands. "Go. Now." But Kyle didn't move. He stood his ground, meeting the Alpha's gaze with unwavering intensity. "Not without you," he repeated, his voice low and fierce. The sound of heavy, magnetized boots locking into place outside the penthouse door echoed through the room. They were here. Reese looked from the open shaft to Cale's defiant face, then back to the door. For a heartbeat, he was paralyzed, caught between a lifetime of ingrained obedience to the system and the illogical, impossible loyalty he felt to the Omega before him. He had built his life on control, on predictable outcomes and logical progressions. Kale was chaos. Kale was a variable he had never anticipated. And that variable was now offering him not an escape, but a shared rebellion. It was the most terrifying and tempting proposition of his life. With a sharp, metallic clang, the sanitization team began to cut through the door's locking mechanism. Sparks flew from the seams. That sound, the sound of the machine coming to reclaim him, broke the spell. "All right," Reese breathed, the word a surrender and a vow. Together. He moved with a speed and precision that was startling. He ripped a data port from the wall, jamming a small black device into the sparking wires. "This will trigger a power surge and a data wipe of the local server when they breach the mainframe," he explained, his fingers flying across a small keypad. "It will buy us a few minutes of confusion." He then turned to the main console, his hands a blur as he typed in a string of commands. "I'm rerouting the building's primary power to the maglev transport system and triggering a full lockdown of all sectors below the 30th floor. A citywide transit alert. It will create chaos. A perfect cover." It was sabotage on a grand scale, wielded with the intimate knowledge of a creator turning against his creation. He was not just escaping the system, he was wounding it, using its own interconnectedness as a weapon against it. The door to the penthouse exploded inward in a shower of molten metal. 2 figures in sleek, white armor, their faces obscured by reflective visors, stormed into the room, assault rifles raised. They were followed by a medtech holding a hypospray. "Director Valka, surrender the asset," the lead enforcer commanded, his voice a synthesized bark. Reese didn't even look at them. He grabbed Cale's arm, his grip firm, pulling him toward the shaft. "Hold on tight," he ordered, and then he jumped. Cale gasped as they plunged into the darkness, the world becoming a rush of wind and the deep, resonant hum of the magnetic field. Reese expertly controlled their descent, using a handheld braking device to slow their fall along the central magnetic rail. Above them, shouts and the sound of weapon fire echoed and then faded. They were falling, down through the heart of the citadel, a place of power and control, now a tunnel to an uncertain freedom. The journey was a dizzying, sensory blur. Flashes of light from service hatches whipped past them, illuminating the complex guts of the building. Kale could feel the solid warmth of Reese's body against his back, a shield against the abyss. He could smell the sharp scent of ozone from the activated braking device, mingled with Reese's own scent of petrichor, a smell of storms and earth in this place of steel and wire. They burst out into a sub-level transit station. The lockdown alarm was blaring, a shrill, incessant pulse. Red lights flashed, casting everything in a bloody, urgent glow. People were running, shouting, a tide of panicked bodies. The chaos Reese had engineered was perfect. In the Undercroft, Kale was a ghost because he was nobody. Here, in the heart of the citadel, they were ghosts because everyone was screaming. Reese, without hesitation, pulled Kale into the river of people, his hand never leaving Kale's arm. He moved with purpose, navigating the panicked crowd as if he had a map of the chaos in his head. They were no longer director and asset. They were two fugitives, two glitches in the machine, running for their lives. They boarded a service transport, a grimy, automated cargo hauler, just as its doors were sliding shut. The car lurched forward, plunging them into the dark labyrinth of the city's underbelly. They were thrown together in the small space, the vibrations of the transport shuddering through them. The alarms faded into the distance. The flashing red lights were gone, replaced by the dim, flickering glow of the tunnel lights. The silence that fell between them was not empty. It was filled with the thunder of their own hearts, the gasp of their own breath. They had done it. They had escaped. But as the transport carried them deeper into the darkness, away from the gleaming spire and into the unknown, Kale knew this was not the end. It was the beginning. The debt was not paid. It had been transformed. Now they owed their lives, their freedom, their future, only to each other. The final scene was not of a sterile penthouse, but of a dark, rattling metal box. Two figures huddled together, surrounded by the scent of ozone, rain, and the wild, untamable smell of time. A promise of something new, something real, growing in the ruins of the world they had left behind.